The recent sentencing in the India gang rape trial has made headlines around the world. 4 men were given the death penalty, and this has forced the country to rewrite its laws on violence against women. Earlier, I spoke to Wendy Murphy, an expert on sexual violence, and asked her if there are any factors preventing stronger laws from being enacted.
Most countries at least have laws on the books that look like they prevent this kind of violence against women. But unless those laws are actively enforced by our leaders, including political leaders, police and prosecutors, and unless the messaging is clear that this is behavior that will not be tolerated, it really doesn't matter what kinds of laws have been enacted. As a result, in countries, not just India, in the United States, countries all over the world where enforcement is a huge problem, we are pointing at things like a failure of leadership as a primary problem because, let's face it, you know, when a woman is raped, it's highly unlikely that the president of the United States will speak out and call it an outrage or say that could have been my daughter. But we know that President Obama did speak out when Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman in Florida. You know, women's rights groups are starting to say things like, why can't he speak out when rape happens or when violence against women happens? And if he doesn't, does that not create a hierarchy that subjugates the value of women's lives? So that kind of narrative and the activism around changing the narrative regarding whose lives are more valued by our political leaders, I think is important and missing in this conversation globally.
Yeah, turning to this very high-profile case in India, the one in Delhi in the capital, where a young lady was raped and she subsequently died from the injury she received during that attack. The death sentence has been passed against the perpetrators of this crime. Do you think it will act as a deterrent?
I'm worried about overstating the power of a death sentence as sufficient in that case to send the right message about rape as an epidemic, because most rapes do not end with the loss of a woman's life. Most rape happens, the vast majority of rape happens without causing death. And people who will correlate this case as sending the right message, I think, are missing the point, which is the silence of 99% of similar crimes where the woman doesn't die. Now, that said, it is important to say that the ultimate punishment, if we're going to apply it at all, be applied against crimes against humanity, and then connect up that idea that rape is a crime against humanity to what happened to that poor woman in that case. If we could speak globally about the nature of violence against women as a human rights problem, that it is not about sex, that it is about the humanity of the victim, whether she lives or dies, then I think the moral outrage will be there, even if the punishment is not ultimately the death penalty.
You know, there was something very interesting, if not alarming, that was in the New York Times about this case in India, in which they quoted a Supreme Court lawyer from India who said something about the legal system there, and she said that the justice system is mired in outdated thinking about violence against women. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that that's an understatement. It's not just that our laws are outdated, it's that in most nations, including those that perceive themselves the most civilized, the laws grow from male ownership of women's bodies. And so long as that's the historical premise and we don't do an entire reboot or a redesign, we're going to be stuck. Even the best judges sometimes are forced into an ideology of thought when addressing and enforcing the laws and issuing punishments, into approaching it based on what we call stare decisis, or clear precedent from the past. And by definition, that means they're going to underpunish and undervalue women's lives during the justice process. So some of the reform ideas that I teach my students include redesigning the base from which rape laws grow. If we can go back to the baseline and design rape laws from the idea of autonomy, personal autonomy, being the intended goal, that we want to preserve human autonomy and not just regulate sex and or deal with male ownership issues around women's bodies, then we're more likely to get the kind of enforcement we need without being hamstrung by reliance on precedent that will never be good enough.